And we've all been joined by one of racing's foremost authors and historians, writer of the celebrated 1990 work, The Druids Lodge Confederacy, which charted the work of one of the most extraordinary training and gambling operations that horse racing has ever seen. He has written extensive books on the history of Manton and Beckhampton, two of the great training centres, and he has recently released this intriguing work, Jewel, How Lord Hastings Stole the Pocket Venus and How Her Fiancé Was Avenged. It is a fantastic story in and of itself, but it raises so many more intriguing aspects of how racing was in the Victorian age. Paul Mathieu, good morning.
Good morning, Nick.
And lovely to see you here as well.
Well, thank you for having me.
You've written so many interesting and important books on horse racing, but not the norm, dare I say it, some of which I've got behind me. You're always looking at it from a slightly different angle. Are you inspired just by things that have interested you along the way?
I guess so. It's like finding a brightly polished pebble on a beach. There's some aspect of a story that you think, gosh, that one would be interesting. And really, that's how the Druids Lodge book started out.
For those who aren't familiar with the Druids Lodge Confederacy, I suspect it will always be your most celebrated work. People talk about it an awful lot, and the sheer audacity of what the Druids Lodge Confederacy achieved. For those who aren't familiar, just give us a brief précis.
Well, it was a stable set up from scratch, built from the ground upwards, right in the heart of Salisbury Plain, about as isolated as you could be, and the isolation itself was an objective, to keep it far away from touts and snooping punters. And they built a stable there with no windows on the outside walls, so everything looked inwards. The lads were locked up at night, so they couldn't give stable secrets away. And the whole raison d'etre was to land gambles. And they laid horses out, sometimes for a couple of years, and then they would launch them in typically a race like the Cambridgeshire. And they won unimaginable sums of money. And it was a sort of league of gentlemen. And they had the bookies absolutely by the throats for a decade or so.
And remind us of exactly when this was.
This was at the turn of the last century and the early years of very early 1900s.
People now would think that was quite extraordinary, that any successful achievement of such an ambition would be difficult enough now, let alone 150 years ago. In truth, was it easier then at the turn of the 20th century?
I'm sure it was, for a variety of reasons that the two gentlemen on my left will know well. Stewarding was extremely haphazard in those days. Sometimes it has to be said the stewards had probably had a very nice lunch, and they didn't watch the race from the same place, so they were seeing different events. And there was no camera patrol. And the form books and all the other guides were rudimentary by comparison with what we have today. But I think the crucial thing is there were no pictures. And so you could hook a horse for several runs and hardly anyone would notice, and particularly what they specialised in. Their biggest ever gamble was a horse called Hackler's Pride. And they ran Hackler's Pride in multi-runner sprint handicaps. You know, the sort of 20, 25 runner cavalry charges that probably keep Ian awake at night, figuring out all the colours. And it's quite easy to bury a horse in one of those races, particularly if you don't have the subsequent tools of a video recording where you can play it as many times as there are horses in the race to see what happened. And so there would Hackler's Pride be at the back of the Stewards' Cup, running on demurely, far too late. And then they spring her over a mile in the Cambridgeshire. And lo and behold, there's a completely different horse on show.
So the one thing that strikes me through all your books is exactly how much money was in the game and exactly how much money was bet as well. It really was a phenomenal punting sport.
Yes.
100 years ago.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I suppose it comes out fairly clearly in Duel that Harry Hastings, the fourth Marquis, was betting in telephone numbers.
Yeah.
I mean, in his case, it was.
And the aristocrats had that kind of money to spend as well, had that disposable cash.
They did. And they were dissipating capital. You know, they were dissipating family fortunes. The characteristics of the people, like, say, the Druids Lodge Quintet, they were wealthy people, sure, but they weren't vastly wealthy the way that Harry Hastings was.
Well, who would be the nearest modern equivalent to, say, the Druids Lodge Quintet?
I'd love some input from my left. I don't think there is one.
I suspect.
No, I don't think it's possible today.
Probably betting goes on in Malaysia or something like that.
Yes.
Is it a question of just superior organisation?
I think they had it relatively easy, in terms of they weren't under any scrutiny, in terms that they built this fortress on Salisbury Plain, and there wasn't any BHA or Jockey Club person coming to visit them and see what they were up to. It was all very enclosed, and every now and then they would march out like a little army and have it off.
And as far as the sort of regime in training yards are concerned, looking at what you saw in the Druids Lodge Confederacy and in your research for that, to what extent did that inform you when you were writing about Manton and Beckhampton, two of the great training establishments that are still going to this day?
Yes, they had different raison d'être. I mean, certainly the old Alec Taylor, who built Manton in 1870, he bet, and they did bet because that was the only way they could accumulate capital. But it wasn't per se a gambling yard. And the same way with Beckhampton, it's had, sure, one or two people in there who've been punters, but it's not a gambling yard. It's about getting good horses and bringing them on slowly and winning good races with them. That's what Beckhampton is about. Whereas Druids Lodge was purely and simply a betting operation. They had horses to run to land gambles.
This country is unique in a sense in its historic nature of the stables. How much have you been helped through all your books by the fact that most of these places still exist and they've had custodians who've kept records, and it's a wonderful thing.
Yes, it is. And no question, when doing a book about Beckhampton, Roger and Claire Charlton have kept an awful lot of archive material. So you get a leg up, and you also get a sense of the tradition and the history. The Druids Lodge, when it was finished, it was finished. They all went their separate ways. The gallops were sadly ploughed up to plant potatoes to feed the army during the war, and there was never any prospect of it coming back together. Or there was a brief reincarnation afterwards with horses like Scottish Union and trainers like Noel Cannon, but that's all finished. It's now a polo ground.
And tell me about how the inspiration came about for Jewel, the new book.
Well, I'd been thinking about, as an obvious sequence to the first three books, of doing something on Danebury and the Day family. But the more I looked at it, the less enthusiastic I became, because
the book tells you why, because the Day family don't come out of this very well.
They didn't come out of life very well. They were a pretty horrible group of people. I mean, master trainers. The accomplishment of John Day Jr., the last of the Days, in 1867, he trained 146 winners, and that was a record that stood for 120 years. And there are not many sporting records that last 120 years. And then Henry Cecil came and kicked the door down and trained 180. But that was 120 years that Day's record stood. He was a master trainer, but their interests were always inwardly focused. They were looking to make money for themselves at the interests of everybody else.
And at the expense of everybody else.
At the expense of everybody else, yeah.
Yeah. And we're totally lacking scruples.
I think you'd have had to search very hard for a scruple in Danebury, yes.
So you didn't want to make them the focus of your book, but they are still an integral part of it, because they were the people that trained one half of these horses.
That trained for Harry Hastings, yes, which was his great misfortune. I mean, I don't know, he had such a clear self-destructive bent that it would have emerged in some form anyway. Even if he'd gone to a thoroughly sensible horse manager like, say, Captain Machell at Newmarket. But the fact is, at the Days, of course, he was manna from heaven. In his early 20s, he had a string of 50 horses. He was the largest owner in Britain. and he had all the money to go with it.
So he was ripe to be taken, and they took him.
He was a pigeon for the plucking. Yeah.
How important do you think it is, Paul, now that racing as it is today has this context, has this rich tapestry, has a history that people understand to give it meaning?
I think that everyone secretly likes a little whiff of gunpowder in their racing. You know, I mean, the chap in the betting shop who sees his fancy go down would much prefer to believe that the jockey had pulled it than that he'd made a serious error of judgment, you know, got the wrong one. And I think, the tapestry of the backstory of all the great gambles and the skullduggery, it just adds a richness, yeah.
And Huey's nodding away sagely to your left.
Nowadays, it's deemed inappropriate to have a coup. And even if it's done, within reason, you have a horse you just don't run for 6 months and let it develop, and you find the right ground. And, the owners has a bit of a punt on it, and it's considered as coup. It's sort of somehow you're not allowed to do that, which seems, the punter does like to think he knows best.
Yeah.
And but it's fine to land a coup, isn't it, as long as you haven't broken any rules?
Well, I'm not sure. I seem to have read a few times recently that we've stopped this sort of multiple bet happening, accumulator across the country when somebody had one in Ireland, one in England, or something. Yeah.
Well, you raise, of course, one of our most celebrated guests on this programme, Mr. Barney Curley, who occupied about an hour of this and was intriguing and extraordinary in equal measure. And I suppose he might be the nearest comparison to say the ingenuity of the first book of the Druid's Lodge.
Yes, I mean, for a moment there, I thought you were going to bring the name of Harry Hastings in alongside Curley. You didn't, and you're right not to, because they're polar opposites.
No, exactly.
Curley is incredibly patient, disciplined, focused,
which is what they were.
Which is what the Druid's Lodge people were. But Hastings, on the other hand, was just like a mad woman's custard. I mean, he would bet on anything, and did, and lost.
Ian, you of course have fond recollections of Paul's work in a former incarnation.
It was Cleary who told me this. Were you not one of the original men who selected Wogan's winner? For those of us of a certain age who remember Radio 2 breakfast time?
I have to plead guilty to that, yes. Yes.
Was it you and...
Tony Fairbairn.
Was the Bish, what's the Bish called? John
Santa.
Was he involved as well?
Yeah,
yes.
He was as well, yeah.
Yes.
So for those who don't remember Wogan's winner, which is probably anyone under the age of 45, I'd say.
Tiptoe, yes.
40, 45. Just Paul, this was Terry Wogan's racing slot.
Yes, at 7:30 in the morning. At 7:30 in the morning, he read a short
driving tomorrow
narrative of the day's racing. There is racing at A, B, C, and D. An update on the going if it had changed, and the culmination was a Wogan's winner, a selection, and we tried very hard to come up with winners. I always remember there was a day when he was doing a personal appearance at Leicester. I forget who for, but I spent hours looking at Leicester races in order to come up with a surefire winner, and eventually rather cravenly produced some odds-on novice chaser of Gifford's, which did win. But Wogan, by contrast, got out of the car in the park at Leicester and was greeted rather nervously by this group who asked for his signature autograph, and then said, "We've got one running in the last, which you ought to be involved in. Wayward Lad." Wayward Lad's debut over hurdles.
So, but the selection won, which was the good thing.
Oh yeah.
Excellent.
But he didn't want to hear about that. Some novice chaser winning at 4-6 when he'd been given this terrific tip in the car park.
And he was a genuine lover of the game, wasn't he, Terry?
Yes, he was. He didn't really bet. He may actually have given me the one of the worst night's sleep of my life when I'd been following, as I used to do in those days, very thoroughly. A couple of months before Cheltenham every year, I used to get the Irish field and see what was happening over there. And there's that memorial race for Eddie O'Grady's father. You know the one, run at Thurles, is it?
I think you foxed us with this one, Paul.
I can't believe that.
Your memory's better than mine.
I come with this trio, and you don't know the race. Anyway, I read a commentary on this race, which was like nothing I've come across before, and certainly since, because it focused entirely not on the winner of the race, but on an also-ran. And the culmination of the report was, for some reason, Mr. Donovan was never nearer. And I thought, this is telling me something. So I told Terry, look, I've got one in one of the novice hurdles at Cheltenham. It's called Mr. Donovan. Help yourself. Well, the day before, I was doing the morning shift and then going straight down to Cheltenham. And I asked Terry, did you have a bet on that? Oh, yes, he said, I had a couple of grand on it, just as you suggested. Well, I lay awake all night, tossing and turning in the pub at Cheltenham, thinking of Wogan's 2,000 quid. The end result was, of course, I had about 1/10 as much on the horse as I'd planned to. And that was the horse that got, allegedly, J.P. McManus going.
Subscribe to Racing TV to be notified when more Luck on Sunday videos are appearing online. And don't forget to join me for the show every Sunday morning from 9 o'clock with the best guests.